Okay, hello everybody. We're very happy and fortunate to have Fritz Neumeyer here tonight to lecture on Mies. And just a few words of introduction about Fritz. Fritz has an architectural degree and a PhD from Berlin. He is currently a professor at the Technical University of Berlin and now is taking a year's leave to be a fellow at the Getty Center for the History of Art and the Humanities here in Santa Monica. His work has been focused most recently about Mies van der Rohe, and his very major work, which is Thoughts on the Art of Building about Mies van der Rohe, will be published in English. It was published in German in 1986. Will be published in English probably early next year by MIT Press. His work with Mies has led him backwards to the work of Schinkel and Gilly and forward to the current architecture. He's also studying, in addition to Mies, the urban architecture of the modern movement, which is a subject that really has not been adequately dealt with. And in this study, he also goes back to Schinkel and ahead to contemporary architecture to look at urban design. So without any other introduction, here's Fritz.
Thank you very much for these introductory remarks. Basically, I will read a paper tonight because I'm a little bit anxious about getting lost in the obstacles of having not a language, because this is not my language I'm used to give lectures in, as you very soon might figure out. And I'm not used for reading papers because usually I'm lecturing at home in a free speech, as it should be. But I hope I will learn in the term of giving more lectures here in the States, and someday I will be able to express what I want to say. Tonight's lecture, and I give another one on Friday, which is dealing on Nietzsche and his impact on modern movement, was given the title Mies and the Philosophical Roots of Modernism. In this lecture, I will go down a little bit more on the historical roots of the Miesian architecture, and to show how they are related. And I want to point out how they are related. Just a second, I have to adjust these pieces here. How they are related to the modern movement in general. So the main point I'm focusing on today is the reception of Mies and the perception of Mies as a part of the perception of modern movement. And I think that this, if one takes a view on the history of the reception and perception of this leading figure of modern movement, one can come to the conclusion that it's time for a revaluation, not even in the case of Mies, but in a broader sense in the modern movement by itself, because I believe both are not that bored, single-minded and one-sided, positivistic or technocratic, anti-traditional insofar as the postmodern critics want make us to believe. The second point I want to make tonight is to give a first insight into the contradictions and the complexity of the Miesian architecture and his thinking, and to show that modernism or modernity and tradition are apparent in the same moment in modern architecture, and that there is a use of history which is quite different from the use we are used to have it today. But there is a strong relationship to history, to tradition, and in the same moment there is a strong attempt for the own time. To see how these two elements are connected together, and to give a little bit more insight of the construction of the concept of these dualistic set of values is the point I would like to make tonight. And the third point I would like to mention before I go into my paper is to show that architecture needs a certain intellectual concept, that it needs an idea, that one first needs an architecture of ideas before one can really have an idea of the architecture itself, that architecture demands not only formal qualities but in first conceptual qualities, and that this idea might be something very different from the nostalgic exploitation of values or history, but has more to do with the translation and the transformation of values. Mies has left behind a set of remarkable sentences. I want to put one of those as a headline over this first part of my lecture, where Mies is saying, "The value of each material is determined by what we make out of it." When Philip Johnson in 1947 had published the first edition of his monograph on Mies, Mies himself was probably the least known among the pioneers of modernism. At that time, the then 61-year-old had erected barely 20 buildings and published a similarly modest amount of terse statements and manifestos, which had appeared in dispersed and frequently remote localities. In contrast to Le Corbusier, who had developed an extraordinarily rich publicistic activity, Mies's aversion toward self-promotion prevented him from making those propagandistic efforts by means of which Le Corbusier, Gropius, and other leading representatives of the new building invited international attention in order to disseminate their thoughts and publicize their buildings. The interest in Mies van der Rohe that Johnson had awakened culminated in the 60s in a series of monographs which largely followed in the footsteps of Johnson. Philip Johnson had initiated a canonical Mies interpretation which, cum grano salis, saw itself perpetuated in the works of Max Bill, 1955, Arthur Drexler, 1960, Peter Blake, 1960, Werner Blaser, James Spire, Ludwig Glaser, Martin Pauli, Peter Carter, Lorenzo Papi, and at least to add another one from 95, David Speth, and which has undergone any essential enrichment until the present time. And the two exceptions which are to be made are the work, or first to mention the work of my German fellow Wolf Tegethoff on the villa and country houses of Mies, published in '81 in Germany, and I guess in '85 with MIT Press. And another one, of course, the biography, the critical biography written by Franz Schulze, which gives us a more detailed view into the life and the circumstances which produced, or as a part produced, the Miesian architecture. Only the monograph of Mies's longtime friend and former Bauhaus colleague Ludwig Hilbersheimer of 1956 constitutes in this set a worthwhile exception. Hilbersheimer did not put the analysis of buildings into the foreground, but attempted to approach Mies's architectural philosophy from a theoretical point of view by setting it into the context of historical continuity, from Leon Battista Alberti's concept of congenitas to Kazimir Malevich's suprematistic reductions. Mies became established as a regular myth in the last decades of his life and saw himself overwhelmed with commissions and honors. A proud series of monographs and a veritable flood of articles paid homage to the master of the modern building, around whom, not least on account of his retiring ways and lifestyle, a regular cult developed. While friends and pupils wrapped Mies in a sort of aura, he experienced downright depreciation at the hands of those epigones who had risen out of the ranks of everyday practice. The seductive simplicity of the Miesian structures, which gives no clue as to the painful process of distillation out of which it arises, experienced in the commercialized world of the building practice a painful devaluation. And I would like to show you at the first slide a very enlightening example Yeah, could we have the lights a little bit turned down? On the left you see a bank building which I discovered when I was in Houston 2 weeks ago at the CAA, the Art Historian Convention. And on the right hand you see the last work of Mies, his gallery of the 20th century, the so-called National Gallery in Berlin. And this small replica, this copy of the original, was even finished before the original was finished. And I guess that these architects didn't meant it as a joke, but they took it for serious. A company called YMCA, standing for a set of names which I didn't find worthwhile to remember in the moment. And we can clearly see that what the difficulties and the dilemma, the tragedy and the comedy in once of this advanced modern movement is, which seems to have no own idea, which even is not able to understand what the leading architect, Mies, the figure, the image, was given here for an example in architecture, and they turn this temple of space, which I don't want to describe now in the moment. They turn it down to a small scale replica, authentic replica, one might say, in a very American tradition, which is showing that modern movement is at its best and as it could be, and there was hardly no need so far to go back into a new revaluation of the historical ornament, because this building itself is an historical ornament. It's so postmodern as postmodernity even could be before the whole thing started. The question as to how far the publicistic propaganda contributed to this vulgarization of the architectural legacy is in itself worthy of investigation. In each of the monographs, one finds inevitably the identical basic inventory of reproduced data. Dates are simply taken over. In those instances where originals were no longer available, one simply made new drawings. An example for this is the legendary blueprint reconstruction of Werner Blaser for the brick and country house. You see it on the left, where the walls seem to radiate far into the landscape and where the building substance dissolves into a complex of wall screens. The painfully accurate blueprint made by Werner Blaser for his monograph of 1965 during a period of contact with Mies himself gives no clue as to authorship, yet it has largely determined the concept of this project insofar as these reconstructions were readily accepted in other circles as Mies drawings. I'm sorry I couldn't find the original Mies drawing for the ground plan, so I added another one which is not so well published, a very quick drawing of that building, a perspective, which was published in the catalog where this whole project for the first time was published at the exhibition of the German November Group in 1924. And one can see from the style of this rendering that it's a very fast, loose rendering. And Mies, in the year of 24, during that period of heroic modern movement where he was publishing manifestos, never would have had the time to give such an exact drawing of every stone of brick here as shown by the Drexler, by the Blaser drawing. That this reconstruction shows a number of differences and deviations from the original, which exists only in a badly reproduced copy, and therefore perpetuates an incorrect rendering, has remained unknown until the just before mentioned publication by Wolf Tegethoff, which has set new criteria for the dealing with data and their analysis. The Mies school had succumbed in a fascination with its own image. Respectful reproductions and misunderstood personal contact on the one hand, and simplification and watering down of ideas and principles by commercial vulgarization on the other, resulted in an atmosphere of discomfort, out of which arose in the 60s and 70s a critique not only directed toward Mies alone, but toward modernism itself. Confessions put into Mies' mouth experienced provocative heretical transformations. The monkish homily, "Less is more," which had been assigned by Johnson to Mies as a personal motto and which had become a regular slogan supposedly characterizing Mies, was expanded by Robert Venturi in Complexity and Contradiction in 1966 into a still respectful and circumspectly expanded "More is not less." Whereas Sibylle Moholy-Nagy's title for her essay has "Less is more" become "Less is nothing," was simply just a rhetorical question. This change of attitude toward the dogma of functionalism and purism delineated itself in the development of architecture since the late 50s and demanded for greater expressiveness and more plastic space definition. Robert Venturi gave theoretical foundations to these trends in the 60s. In his gentle manifesto, as he called it, that calls for more context-enriched architecture, he pleads for a reclaiming of complexity. The vulgarized concept of "less is more" has led, according to Venturi, to an architecture which has become anemic and boring and which could be dispatched with "less is a bore." Venturi's theory of complexity and contradiction affirms the delight in contradiction, but decidedly denies, although this hardly has come to awareness, incoherence and caprice, as well as picturesqueness and excess. Appreciation for the significance of complexity in architecture need not deny the demands for simplicity. Venturi recognized that the buildings of Mies van der Rohe opened valuable opportunities for the development of architecture, but that their selectivity and formal language constituted both a limitation and a strength. Critique concerned with a more nuanced evaluation remained in the background, as opposed to those polemical sounds with which one now attacked the icons of modernism. Bertrand Goldberg, one of the early dissidents arising out of the Chicago school that had formed around Mies, confronted it now with a defiant motto, "Rich is right." Stanley Tigerman, who also originated in these circles, illuminated this change of parameter with a photomontage which he gave the title Titanic. Meant ironically, but not without a symbolic play on reality, Crown Hall, the incunable of modern steel and glass construction of the early 50s, a building which Mies himself had called one of his best, is shown sinking into Lake Michigan. The critical voices which accompanied Mies' work were seldom free of polemic. One can hear it reverberate in the question, can one live in Haus Tugendhat, which Justus Bier had said over his contemplations in 1931, where he spoke of this house in terms of display living and insufferable presentation style, making it a showroom rather than a home. Here you have it. With the critics of the succeeding period, such as Joseph Rickword, who denounced the campus of the Illinois Institute of Technology from 1949 as a, quote, slick, lucid, sickening scheme. Here you have it. One could form a separate chronicle. And I think it's very interesting to take a view on these designs, which I think are really conservative so far as it is a classical disposition with axis and symmetry, and has really nothing to do with, or at least not very much to do with the so-called open plan of the modern architecture. And it's as it shows, a combination of values. It is a classical shaped plan, but with pieces, deliberate pieces of modern architecture in it. And if you, for example, would compare it with some work of Krier or other architects, which of course use a completely different style of building, but you would have a not so far different plan concerning axis and the definitions of space. If one would take all these critics together, one could form a chronicle that lead us from the publicistic battles that raged around the Farnsworth House, with that for the McCarthy era typical aggressiveness against modernism, right up to Mies's last building, the new National Gallery in Berlin, which Julius Posner, you see it on the right, and on the left you see the Farnsworth House, which Julius Posner carried away by a conflict between admiration and disdain called, quote, a junk dealer's place. Fascination and polemic have their common roots in the problematic of the Miesian architecture, which refuses to subordinate aesthetic considerations to social ones. Both critics and admirers tend towards polarization. Rainer Benham saw the sterility of this tendency and summed up the situation with the question, absolute good or absolute bad. On one hand, there existed a worldwide network of admirers who elevated the buildings of Mies to the rank of absolutes of architectural perfection, and who saw in them the emanation of the ideal Cartesian model. On the other hand, there were those who, like Louis Mumford, saw in Mies a Procrustes demanding that human nature adapt itself to his architectural idiosyncrasies. These absolutizing viewpoints reflect less on the architecture itself than on a certain helplessness in the camp of the critics. It was only to be expected that this one-sidedness would lead to symptoms of exhaustion. While Mies entered upon a final phase of mastery, the purification of the mature concept of structure, his pupils, with Philip Johnson in the lead, began to deny him their allegiance. The signal to this process of detachment was given by Philip Johnson himself with the 1955 publication of his lecture, The Seven Crutches of Modern Architecture, and by Benham, who opened his essay, Almost Nothing is Too Much, in '62, reiterating one more time the virtues of the Miesian architecture with What Has Happened to the Mies van der Rohe fan club. The crisis around Mies cannot merely be explained by the general discomfort with modern architecture in the 60s. It was, so one must conclude, to a certain degree self-created. The monographs on Mies were partially to blame for the manner in which Mies was presented and finally consumed. The Mies image had become static. Philip Johnson, who had been enthused over Mies in the 20s on account of his cool objectivity and his aloofness from the avant-garde movements of that period, and who preferred him over Le Corbusier and Out because he saw him as less factory-like, more classical, founded a Mies image which merely experienced consolidation at the hands of his successors. Contradictions within the work, to the degree they were then noticeable, were played down. The early work had been subjected, presumably on Mies's own initiative, to a strict process of selection, and the 20s and 30s were presented as a preparatory phase for the major achievement of the American years. The message which one superimposed over the oeuvre consisted of a topic of timeless perfection, obsessive attention to detail, and a delight in expensive and luxurious material. Subsequent writing did not except raise these ideas and phrases from one homage to the next, thereby reducing the one-sided and granite image of the great architect, now a monolithic symbol for universality and perfection, through constant repetition to meaninglessness. Indeed, there exists only one single, truly deviationist interpretation of Mies, namely that of Bruno Saby, submitted in the pioneer work Poetica dell'Architettura Neoplastica published in Milano in 1953. It turns out, however, to be no less unilateral than the canonizing approach via Johnson. Bruno Saby does not follow the well-trodden path and the teleological model of a career moving in orderly progression towards a single aim, a theory which reads like an analogy to Mies's concept of the gradually unfolding form, but rather attempts to interpret Mies's career by means of two contradictory concepts: classicism on the one hand and neoplasticism on the other hand. Both concepts are, however, for Bruno Saby, ideologically determined. Classicism is equated with despotism and rigidity. Neoplasticism, as emancipation from the symmetrical axis and the traditionally enclosed form and order concepts, is equated with freedom and democracy. Provided one accepts these definitions and assignments of meaning, one can view the development of Mies as a parabola. At its apex stands the buildings of around 1930, the Barcelona Pavilion, the Tugendhat House, and the model house for the Berlin Building Exhibition of 31, which can be viewed as the realization of neoplastic aims formulated by the De Staël movement. The ascending branch of this parabola corresponds, according to Saby, to Mies's phase of liberation from neoclassicism, the descending branch to a gradual sinking back into neoclassicism with the buildings after Barcelona. Mies, whose merit it was to have transposed the volumetric language of neoplasticism into spatial terms, relocked himself, according to Bruno Saby, into the shackles of formalism. Rationalism regressed again to neoclassicism, to sum up his viewpoint. The battle between classicism and neoplasticism in the work of Mies van der Rohe is much more complex than Bruno Saby makes it out to be. It is not a single parabola, but an ongoing oscillation accompanied by many hesitations and changes of positions. An exact analysis of buildings and ideas refutes the parabola model as Saby renders it. The dialectical exchange between pro-classical and anti-classical concepts and ideas is constantly present in Mies's work. Mies not simply exchanged old values for new ones, but the dialogue between these poles continued on successively new levels, as it is evident from the simultaneity of neoclassical country houses, for example, and bold experiments. Like to show this on the left, the Haus Feldman was designed during 21, and the other one is dated to October 22, and this is exactly the time when Mies was working at the competition for the glass skyscraper for the Friedrichstraße, which took place in December, in the month of December and January, so 21 to 22. An image everybody knows, and I found a contribution to that design here in LA as well as a quotation and a part in a building which I guess is very familiar to all of you. Even in the apex of the parabola, have the traditional values by no means become obsolete. If one draws on so far not utilized sources, such as, for example, a for the first time exploited notebook of Mies from the year of 28, which I found in the archives of the Museum of Modern Art, and which so far never has been used because of very obvious reasons, as it's written in German, and it's written in pencil on paper in a style which you usually use when you write a kind of diary, which abbreviations. And this notebook, for example, they were not able to date it in New York, was clearly written in the years late 27 up to early 29, as I figured out, and it contains a lot of quotations out of books. So this notebook gives us a clear indication and evidence of what Mies was reading during these years, because there are a lot of quotations out of books. For example, it reappeared for several times. There comes the word Como, like the Italian city, and then there comes a number, which is obviously a reference to a page number, and a very remarkable sentence follows. But who is Como? And I never found an author called Como, and it took me a while to find out that this Como was an abbreviation for letters, for a publication, Letters from Lake Como, by the Italian philosopher who was very familiar in Germany during the 20s, who Mies met, who was personally friend with him, Romano Guardini. And this book was published exactly for the first time in October 27. So this was one evidence to date the notebook. It could not have been written, at least these quotations, earlier before 27. And when I went to Chicago, where the greatest part of the Miesian books and the Miesian library is kept, I found this book and the edition. I will show you a page a little bit later out of that, and found the underlinings and markings so that I could trace it back to what Mies really was reading. The interesting point so far to mention is that this is exactly the planning phase of the high point of this parabola, of the apex of this parabola, so to speak, and that is showing us what Mies really was what kind of thinking Mies really was involved with. And this is not, as Saby is suggesting, the point of the greatest liberation from the classical ideas and ideologies, but just, one might say, in contra, just in opposite, an attempt to reunite the classical and the modern thinking, and the classical and the modern philosophy. So it is not simply the exchange of old values against new ones for new ones, but it is in the same moment a translation or a transformation of historical values, or a synthesis that stands as idea over the apex of this parabola. And in accordance with a motto, everything decisive happens in spite, as Friedrich Nietzsche has put it, a motto which Adolf Loos had made to his maxim, one can assume, in reversal of Saby's argument, that the desire for a more profound concept of traditionalism has led Mies to those creations which he formulated around 1930, classical modernism. And I would like to show you one page here out of that notebook on the left, which the sentence here, do you see it? It's referring to to reading. This is page 121 of Guardini, and then you find a sentence here: Philosophisches Verstehen offenbart erst die rechte Würde und den Dienst und den Wert unseres Daseins, which means that only philosophical understanding offers us an order which gives us a clear understanding of our being and the dignity of our being. Another sentence here is clearly directly against the functional understanding of planning and the organization. But I don't want to go into these details today. I want just have an overview on it, and I would like to give evidence of my thesis here with only a few very selected items. Like this slide I'm showing on the right hand, it's a sheet which fell out of one Mies book when I was in Chicago. It's a sheet, it's a bill or a receipt from a bookstore, Herdersche Buchhandlung Berlin, a very famous traditional bookstore in Berlin, and it shows that Mies was ordering a copy of the magazine Die Antike, The Antique, because this issue, volume 4, number 3, contained an essay written by the philosopher Jäger, Plato's Stellung, which is Plato's position in the education and the thinking of humanism. So that this letter shows very clear that Mies had heard, he knew Jäger, and of course he was interested in reading that essay on Plato, just as we can figure out in the year 28. This sheet is dated 23rd of July of the year 28, the planning phase of Barcelona, just to remind you again. And he gave this bookstore a phone call, we might guess, ordering that issue because they made the remark on that receipt that this issue is containing the essay Mies was asking for. This shows that he is really clearly interested in classical thinking, in classical philosophy, one might say, in Plato again. But this is not an interest which is, to put it on the other side, it's not something like being the only belief or back to the roots or back to classical thinking. It's a more complex theme because we have to relate it to other things, and I would like to show you, just to set this, as I mentioned, in relation to the Barcelona Pavilion, which has to be read on the one hand as the statement back to Plato, which this philosopher I just mentioned, Romano Guardini, was pleading for, but he was pleading for we have to go back to Plato with Nietzsche and with Kant, with the modern autonomy. We have to bind the modern autonomy. This would be the concept of another modernism, and Mies is exactly in his lecture he was giving in 28 on the preconditions of modern architecture. He's exactly repeating that phrase that we have to build a new modernism, another modernism, a modernism that is able to bind the individual forces but not losing the capacity of the individual in the same moment. So this is, I think, a very interesting point on the understanding of its architecture. And the Barcelona Pavilion, for example, is, because it has no function than to be itself, a piece of exhibition, is a clear demonstration of the Miesian thoughts of this time, and we can read it in this bound duality of values. On the one hand, the classical thinking, the classical value, which is the podium, which could represent the Platonic view of world with this massive absolute image, and on the other hand, on top of this order, on top of this belief, there are the modern values expanding. There comes this composition of freestanding walls and the floating roof, and there we have all the openness which is related to the modern world and to the modern thinking, which no longer has a belief in one center and one point. So that's not the closed world view, but the openness in this sense. And as you can see it here, the ground plan, and we have the oscillation between these two poles. Even in the structure itself, it's a complex play on closed space and open space. As we can see it here on the ground plan, there are these sheltering elements like arms laid around the space here, and if you enter it from outside, it seems to be a massive block, but if you turn around, then you see it's only a plain surface around another space. And we have on the other side these two figures. I would like to present them to you, which are the most important philosophers for Mies, for his career and his thinking, and which haven't been recognized so far in all the other books I just have mentioned. The first is Alois Riel. You are seeing on the left side. He will reappear in my lecture on Friday because very interesting accident. He is the very first patron of Mies. He's building the house for him at the age of 20. It's the first house Mies ever did. And Riel is a philosopher, and he is the first one who ever published a book on Friedrich Nietzsche in Germany. The book Friedrich is called Friedrich Nietzsche, the Thinker and the Artist, and he's going on the philosophy of culture of Friedrich Nietzsche. So this figure stands with the entering of architecture for Mies himself, because the first building he ever did is the building for a philosopher. So the entrance into architecture itself is very close related to philosophy. One can say philosophy is the first patron, or a philosopher to be more precise, is the first patron for Mies. And then comes this second, the most important figure for Mies. He knew both very well. As I mentioned, that is Romano Guardini, here in the photo shown out of the 20s, who was the most influential for what Mies did after 25, 26. And we can clearly indicate the shift in his thinking out from the 20s to the readings of Romano Guardini. I'll show you, just to point out another piece of paper which came into my hands on the left hand, which I think is very funny. It's an episode that makes in itself more clear than one could express with scholarly work. It's the birthday address for the 80th birthday for Alois Riel, a printed address. I found that in the files of the archives in Washington. And before that, there was another printed address asking Mies, as several others, to give a contribution to the 80th birthday of the philosopher Alois Riel, and everybody should send in some amount of money or other things to buy him a present. In those years where the inflation was, it was really hard to get something of worth together. And so they all were asked by this letter, and then appeared the printed address on the birthday, which was given to Riel. And on this printed address speech, there is the list of all the people who are congratulating and giving their present to the honored figure. And you can see in the alphabetical order that there is no, between Fritz Medicus, you find here really a selected list of names which are related to the German intellectual scene, like Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche and other philosophers. But at the point where Mies's name in the alphabetical order should be listed up between Fritz Medicus and the famous Al-Mahmoudi, there is no Mies. But Mies himself, he forgot obviously to send in his gift in time. He himself made a mark here at this place and put on the side, wrote with this is his writing, wrote down Mies van der Rohe, Berlin. So he himself felt very close to this community of the friends of the philosopher Alois Riel, and he even designed the tombstone for him after his death in 25. This, on the other hand, I'm showing you one page, a double page out of the book written by Romano Guardini, and I'm showing it just for graphic reasons, because Mies, when he was reading books, was just making faint remarks, and he had a great respect of the printed page and the letter, and he was using pencil and did only very, very reduced underlinings and stuff like this. But in this book, one clearly can read that something like an inner earthquake happened, and that his hand with a pencil is registrating like a seismograph the movements which are going on while he was reading that book. And he even is writing his own headlines in here, like here, which means a canon to recognize. And you can see that there's hardly not a line which is not marked with double or marked with double and others. So this shows very clear how much he was impressed by that stuff he was reading there, by the ideas of this philosopher itself. The history of modern movement in its entirety, from the Enlightenment around 1800 until the 20th century, can be viewed, to come back to Bruno Saby's argumentation, as a comparative conflict between classical and modern worlds, as a perpetual dialogue of pro and anti-classical concepts, as this appears in philosophy itself, because the Guardini is the one who is really fond of Nietzsche and Plato. So he is in both worlds together, and he sees the modern thinking, the problem of modern philosophy, as a problem of just to build a field of opposites. And he is even writing and publishing a book, which Mies, of course, had and was heavily reading, called The Opposites, a philosophy of contradictions and opposites, a really philosophical forerunner of Venturi's complexity and contradiction, one might guess, where he is pointing out and making clear that the opposites, that a whole is consisting out of a set of opposites, and that these pieces are belonging together. And he's giving a clear lecture. You can read it again in Mies's statements on form and life in the famous debate with Walter Rietzler. He's giving a very clear lecture, a lesson on life and art, on form and life, and the relationship of these, which are highly recommended by Mies and assimilated. So, however, one should not view this dialogue merely as a simple dualism between a liberating organicism and a repressive classicism, as Saby postulates. And I would like to show it in one example, that these things are, in the Miesian work, are belonging together from the beginning on. This is another of his famous projects, the concrete office building designed in 23. A design which today is claimed to be guilty for all the rest of modernity because it's rigid, would be rigid and repetitious and whatsoever. But if one takes a closer look to this design, which looks very functional and rational and positivistic, one can see that this is only the first glance, but that behind that surface of modernity and rationality, there is another set of values appearing, the classical world, one might say, which comes up if you go and take a look on the structure. We have a clear rhythm in this structure, one could say an ABA rhythm, because the end bay of this structure is clearly wider than the rest of it, and we might assume that this enlarged bay at the corner is appearing on the other side again, and we can read it, and this elevation in this side here, we can clearly see that the bays are that there is an A, B, 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 A rhythm structuring the facade. That's one point which is obvious if we take a closer look. A second point is that all these that this rectangularity of the building is not existing, but that there is every story is coming out over the next, so there's an enlarging of the stories, that we have a building that is really creeping out into the street, into the space of the street. And this is not an imagination. You can clearly read it if you follow the last window at the corner. If you follow it up here, you can see how it differs from all the other windows, which are a repetition of one size. But the last window is enlarging. If you go up, you see that on every story it gets a little bit, it grows, it gets a little bit larger, gets a little bit larger. So this shows that the building is opening up, that there is no story like the other one might say. So it's not repetitious, it's very, very well designed. It's a kind of hidden classicism, a secret classicism, one might suggest. And I would like to compare it with two other pieces here. On the left hand, you see a very classical building by Peter Behrens, the Wiegand House, designed for a famous German archaeologist, Theodor Wiegand. And this classical building is, as you take a closer look to the wall, you have the same effect just in the other direction. It's, if you follow the line down, you see that it's going out into a curve like a part of a parabola, so that you don't have a wall just really coming down. You don't have the classical order of a podium, which is like the Egyptian pyramid, going out out of the rectangularity, but we have a curve, like a curve of that time appearing, for example, in the Zeppelins or other things, which is referring to the technical world, and which, on the other hand, gives the building the effect of getting light and being lifted up. Or we could trace that kind of formal employment, as I have pointed out, to the fashion of its time, the expressionistic architecture, like here in the design of Eric Mendelssohn for the Kemper Place in 22, 23, exactly in that time, designed in that time when Mies made his concrete office building design, which is using the new materials for expressive means and to show the new plasticity which could be gained if one would use it, and where we have again this coming out of every of the roof plates and to give the wall the shape of a rhythmic plasticity. So what is to conclude about this? It showed that Mies, on the one hand, if one might conclude this, is interested in the classical tradition. This is the building, the Wiegand house, which was designed during the time when Mies was in the office of Peter Behrens as an employee. He knew it very well, and we have evidence that he was working on the plans as well, as I will show it, that he knew it very well because he made a repetition of the ground plan and nearly a copy. On the other hand, we might assume that Mies, of course, even he was rejecting all the modernist fashions like the expressionism as subjectivistic and aesthetic speculation, that he, of course, was hungry, we might say, to use all these new ways of giving a building form and shape, and that he found, to come back, if we can switch it back to these again, that he found his way of reuniting all these contradictions to a form which on the first side is very simple, it's simplified, but on the second glance becomes very rich and very complex and contradictive. So this is to say the struggle between classical and pro-classical and anti-classical values is apparent on another level. I would just to point it out here, the entrance solution, the kind of portico he employed here, can be clearly related, I would say. The one who knows is, of course, reminded by the famous Schinkel portico at the old museum, where he showed that panoramic view into the city. And Mies himself called the museum building of Schinkel a building which was able to, which one could learn everything about architecture that could be learned about architecture. In general, the pro-classical tendency leans toward the essential typical. It is countered by the anti-classical attitude, which attempts to deny, as far as possible, that art is subject to the stricture of type. This configuration does not appear for the first time with the modernism of our century, which started to oppose academic and classicism around 1900, but which simultaneously, under the sign of the Doric column, reappeared the way for modern prepared the way for modern architecture. The contradiction between pro-classical and anti-classical attitudes is intrinsically as old as architecture itself, and is not unilaterally solvable. Just as the type as ideal can never be fully realized, can it ever be totally overcome without exposing architecture to anarchy? For it is already implicit in the basic principles of construction. This conflict manifested itself in many ways in the history of the building arts. In the battle between the Baroque garden tradition on the one hand and the romanticism of English landscape gardening in the 18th century on the other, in the contradiction between cubic enclosedness and functional directed asymmetry in Karl Schinkel, who moved freely between, as he called it, absolute symmetry and Greek freedom, as is reflected in his museum's architecture and in his country houses, which stood under the influence of the Italian villa style. These works prefigure with their pavilion system the open modern space, which Mies took up again as a theme in a new way, employing the means of his own period. And I would like to remind you to keep in mind the ground plan of this Charlottenhof country house. Here you have the museum, that's the inner portico I showed you. Can I have it a little bit more clearer? No. Yeah, a little bit. And this is the ground plan on the right of the Charlottenhof, done in 1830. Could you focus a little bit the right one? And here you see these contradictions I mentioned, which will reappear in the Miesian building. This is the kind of Barcelona pavilion of the early 19th century, which shows us a symmetrical classical type building with a middle, with a central ABA structure and added to this structure asymmetrically there is a pergola reaching out into nature, and this pergola is ending up in a kind of a choir or what is it called? I have the term is of a kind of bay apse and apse. Thank you very much. An apse to capture the space like an arm laid around nature, open to the other side. It's on a terrace again, like the Barcelona Pavilion. One could see, and this whole design is just to relate that one building with its surrounding, with nature, and the whole composition is to gain a unity and a wholeness between architecture and nature. And as you can see on that engraving here, that the people are living in, they're very relaxed and they are busy with themselves, reflecting upon nature and their own life and culture, as one might suggest. The same kind of constructing a ground plan or a building can be seen in that Behrens villa I showed you before. This is the ground plan here on the right. We have the classical U-shaped type building, and then we have on the one side these reaching out pergola, which goes back and captures a space in front of this building, and we have another kind of peristyle set as an entrance. What Mies is doing in his building, the Werner House of 1913, a building that I discovered in 1978 and published for the first time, and it was striking to see the resemblance if you compare the ground plans. This is the Miesian ground plan for that building, which really doesn't look like a Mies building. It looks more like Heimatstil Schulze-Naumburg of that time. But it shows that Mies was obviously not very much interested in the formal aspects of the outer skirt of a building, but much more in the organization of space. And we have a clear reference to the Wiegand House ground plan. Mies is doing a slight alteration. He pulls the middle out instead of setting it back like Behrens does. And then this typical composition, the way of compositioning a ground plan which Behrens did using the U-shaped type of building, then moving a square, which is this here, into that figure to distort it so that you get asymmetry. And this square, of course, is proportioned like the diagonal of that building reappears here. And then to add this asymmetrical part to it, so that one could say that this asymmetry is just more pointing out the whole power of that symmetry. And Mies is doing really the same here on the right, on the left hand. He's using that classical closed shape, and then comes this anti-classical modern way of disturbing the closed figure to break it up. And he's using a square, but he cuts out a yard at this place, and the square and the circle which appear at this place and that building where both are connected appears in the main hall at the entrance. And then comes the pergola, which is in exactly with the same amount of columns after that building. So this shows, to come back to Schinkel, who was trying to relate the building with its surrounding by these elements, the pergola, to using the classical type building, and then it stretches out its arms like elements here, like being praying to the sunset in this exposed location here at a lake in Glienicke. And these elements, the relationship of these elements becomes a Miesian theme, and one might say that this pavilion system is the main theme of Mies. And I'll show you the first house he did in 1907 for that philosopher I just mentioned, the philosopher Alois Riel. And we have the same contradictions we found here in another set. We have the classical, symmetrical, traditional building in this facade here. It's a building with two faces, the very bourgeois building, and on the other side, in this elevation, we see it completely opened up. The building opens into a pergola to communicate with the landscape. It's situated into a lake. I don't show you the ground plan. I won't go into the details. But this shows very clear that this theme of structure and volume of the classical type of building and the pavilion has become a theme which Mies was aware of its meaning and its depth of its relation. under different occurrences during the whole career of the Mies, and in between you can see the whole career, because this is the very first building, and this is the last building of Mies. And I would like to add a couple of more of these examples to show this oscillation between classicism, between classical and anti-classical values. Another Schinkel piece, the well-known pavilion at the Charlottenburg Palace. Very interesting, not only from the formalistic point of view, because Mies is doing, I'll show it here in the next, nearly an exact replica out of it, just to switch back. Another point which is very interesting is the relationship to space, because Schinkel put this building next to a Baroque plan axis, as you can see it here, with its strong, powerful system of symmetry and axis, and he put the pavilion to this space. Can you read it? There you have it, this small cube. And if you enter that space, for example, in the center, and then you are twisted around, you usually are overpowered by this axis, but then you turn around and you see at the end of that, you see this small building with this opening in the pergola, and the whole power of the axis is switching. You really have the imagination that Schinkel is with a little trick, is absorbing all these actual energy for his little building to concentrate all these perceptions to that building. And exactly, don't show you the slide tonight, exactly this is the same position, just to mention it, which Mies chose when he had the choice to make where he should put his Barcelona pavilion, and this exposition era is in the same way structured. There's a main axis, Baroque of 19th century, then you have the Spanish castle in front of it, and Mies put it on the other side of the side. He chose a very similar, identical position for his pavilion to pass through. So that shows that he was aware of the Schinkel theme, and if you remember the engraving I showed you of the portico in the museum building, this is a repeating of the baluster, the parapets of the large second floor windows of the Palace House, show that this is the replica of the banister that decorates the gallery in the stair of the museum's loggia. Mention of these models should enable one to see the ground floor loggia of this Palace House as a kind of pergola within the building, moreover as a pillared hall pushed into the cube to form a tectonic skeleton whose structure has all but disappeared into the wall. Its concern can be made out as a play of rabbet and joints, as you see it here, and Mies is really very much interested to show that this kind of structure which enters the block is clearly to be read, as he really points out the little corner here running down. One had to draw it, which looks like the other pillar, which is sunken into the wall. It's coming out only like the tip of an iceberg appearing in the wall, but making clear that his concern for structure is evident. Here too, the pillar system is the skeletal support bearing the essential order, and to quote it in Schopenhauerian terms, the thoroughbass of all architecture, as a carrier of the historical memory and of new ideals of openness, thus as a carrier of development. Since Enlightenment, the pavilion as a building type has been the conveyor of a new concept and of new spatial ideas. In his influential study from Ledoux to Le Corbusier, Emil Kaufmann affirmed in the 30s the pavilion system's breaking open of Baroque containment as the decisive development in the architecture of the French Revolution. Other important innovative motives of modernism were the attraction to archetypes, the urge to pierce the block, and the attempt to bring the building into emotional harmony with the landscape. Friedrich Gillies' design for a pillared hall from 1798, on the left you see it, and I'll just juxtapose it to another pillar hall, the famous Farnsworth House, was the first instance of a pure skeleton building, a form destined to develop into the most important concept of modern architecture. Gilly distilled architecture to the basic abstract construction skeleton, which became both expression and symbol of ontological tectonics. The Pilot Hall, with its special kind of monumentality, was an architecturally experimental form that emerged at the outset of a historic development. It led beyond Schinkel, the pioneer of the classical romantic tradition, to the early modern aesthetic of bare building, thence to a profound reorientation of architectural priorities under the notion of the chaste beauty of the naked construction. And this is, one could see the progress in this kind of development. On the left you see Schinkel's museum on the ground plan, and the right you see the Crown Hall, the ground plan for the Crown Hall, and one could clearly see how he's related to the classical order, but on the other hand how much he is opening it up, and it's only the very essential parts to give an image of the classical order, but to open it up completely on the outer skirt to make a pavilion out of that order. And another one, here you have it under construction. Yes, I would come to the next point here. The work of Mies reflects a contradiction, as the modernism of the 20s inherited a burdened historical legacy. If Bruno Saby's work breaks with a canonical view of history and opens up an enlarged comprehension, it also re-obstructs the view. It is one of the productive ironies of this century's architectural history that only by rehabilitating classicism, the possibility of a new comprehension of modernism with its stress on complexity and contradiction seems attainable. The oversimplified identification of classicism, of type, block, and geometry with the authoritative, and the optimistic equalization of free planning with democratic blocked out a more profound understanding of modernism. Postmodernism, a term that increasingly seems to solidify, with its somewhat diffuse sympathy for history, has contributed a renewed appreciation for classicism, as indicated by such mind-stretching terms as postmodern classicism or the daredevil proclamation of a freestyle classicism. The architectural theories underlying postmodernisms arise out of an indirect response to the unilateral interpretation and ideological fixation of Sabian provenance by demanding a semantical revamping of the term classicism. As classicism without tears, to quote Charles Jenks, it needs to be liberated from those oppressive overtones attached to its forerunners, from whom it differentiated itself by a free and non-predetermined employment of forms. This revolutionizing of the term classicism opens up the opportunity to perceive the architecture of Mies and the modern architecture in a new light. Not only because in its history is always present, a circumstance which should endear it to the postmodernist point of view, but because after one has tired of those at best playful quotation games, the desire for poetical serenity, structural honesty, and a heightened intensity of form will awaken all the more. The inherited model of modernism is in need of revision. The current thesis needs complementation and relativization. The across-the-board accusation that modern architecture is hostile to tradition, reckless of the environment, that it results in uniformity, and that it lacks sensitivity of scale must also be seen as the direct result of a dogmatically limited manner of history writing. One-sided interpretation models, with their particular historical slant on modern architecture, have exerted influence simultaneously on the level of perception and reception. For this reason, the critique of modern architecture must also include a critique of the history of architectural writing in regard to modernism and must deal with such influential books as Gideon's Time, Space and Architecture, which presents the history of modernism as a construct free of contradiction. That this type of history writing, which sees transitions as linear events, does not hold up if the transitions are singled out for an accurate analysis, has been proven by the brilliant writings of Witkover's pupil Colin Rohe in the 50s, who called Mies a space-time palladium. I think that's a good characterization. They prepared the way for a more aggressive interpretative attitude in which the aspect of historical continuity in particular is taken under scrutiny. In regard to the work of Mies, this implies that one has to take up a position with a side radius which not only permits to take in unity and universality, but also discontinuities and reciprocal interactions. The critical view of the history of modern architecture calls for a nuanced change of evaluation. Modernism has not only broken with tradition, but also has drawn a complex and contradictory underground network of historical roots. This constitutes the research interest of our time. For Mies, the question after the nature of the building art was of decisive significance. It led him to search for the truth, as he mentioned it, in the quarries of ancient and medieval philosophy. From this question started the search for a spiritual centrum of orientation for architectural truth. Without it, there could be no clarity in the relationship between essence and apparition, necessity and possibility, construction and form. The problems of the building arts cannot be viewed apart from the problems of being. Architecture must serve life not only practically, but also spiritually, and must become the support basis for ideas which touch on the entire existence of man. In this sphere of meaning, in the realm of values, lie the actual, the decisive problems with which architecture must come to terms. It is of this that architecture should speak in the language of the building arts in order to participate in the large discourse concerned with a new genuine order, and even if this genuine order is called a culture of fragments as we tend to noun it today. It is this readiness to view things in a fundamental way, this desire to ask genuine questions after meaning and value, which make Mies' building and his written statements as well such unique testimonials to architectural theory and architectural history of our century. Mies participated in the dialogue surrounding Neues Bauen in its decisive historical phases, both as a propagandist and as a critic. And this is very much overseen. And I would like just to point it out, to add one quotation to this, give you the concluding words of his speech at the Werkbund in Vienna in 1930, which should be seen in relationship to his early manifestos, where he's claiming architecture as the will of the epoch and just the result of the fulfilling of functional technical demands. In opposite to this, he is now speaking in his conclusion, in his concluding words of 1930, the new time is a fact. Whether we say yes or no to it, it's a pure given. Decisive is only how we assert ourselves in respect to these givens. It is here that the intellectual problems begin. It depends on the how, not on the what. That we produce goods and the means by which we produce them says nothing intellectually. Whether we build high or flat with steel or glass declares nothing as to the value of a building. Whether one aims for centralization or decentralization in urban planning is a practical question, not one of values. And it is exactly the question of values that is decisive. We have to set new values and point to ultimate goals in order to arrive at new criteria. For the meaning and justification of each period, even our, own is determined by the ability to create conditions under which the spiritual can exist. Nearness and distance, call and warning, a yes and no speak out of these sentences. Mies, who had by then, with the building of the Barcelona Pavilion and the Tugendhat House, risen to a prominent position within the ranks of modern architecture, accepted the function-orientedness of his age as a precondition, which, while harboring its own potential, does not constitute in and for itself a proper theme for architecture. His skeptical rationalism reveals a comprehensive attitude towards architecture which opposes, in a sort of double-frontedness, any type of unilateral reductiveness. One learns from the comments Mies made around 1930 that he refused to leave building in the grip of technology, but neither did he want to see it turned over to aesthetical speculation. Neither anonymous technical power nor acts of free interpretation by individual artists were accorded priority. The art of building, so Mies prints in boldface, is always the spatial expression of intellectual decisions. And decisions demand, so one can conclude, criteria and principles. They demand intellectual rules based on a logic of order by means, of which fact and meaning, object and subject relate to each other and impart meaning to the process of living. I'll ask you for another 2 minutes and then I'm finished. Extreme precision and consequentiality, extraordinary simplicity, and the generosity are the means by which Mies conceptualized architecture. By the finality of their statement, the buildings are transformed into Platonic objects which seem to declare the universally valid principles of architecture. Subjected to a demanding form-giving process, these objects convey a pronounced sense for space, mass and proportion. They not only invite contemplation, but also call for a physical possessing of space by movement. Viewed that way, these buildings reflect, as Mies expressed it in that fateful year of 1933 in regard to the spatial organization of their Hofhaus, the yard house designs, a measure of freedom, to quote him, for the modern individual, which we will not relinquish anymore. Mies conceived of building as arising out of a field of tension, the poles of which consist of intrinsic essentiality on the one hand and of creative freedom on the other. It should permit man the necessary seclusions within the freedom of open spatiality and make available a protecting but not an enclosing space to harmonize with the contemporary modes of living, as you can see it here. In the next examples again, which I think give a clear expression of what he is meaning, a space which is not secluding or enclosing, but it gives the minimum of shelter and protection the modern man needs, and on the other hand it gives the maximum of openness and freedom which he needs in the same moment. Behind this concept of space and architecture, which defines building in the philosophical sense as the forming of reality, to quote Mies, stood the question which touched on the value and dignity of human existence. So Mies wrote in his notebook, "Is the world as found bearable for man? Can it be shaped in such a way that it is worthwhile to live in?" To raise the art of building to the level of an intellectual act means that architecture must first of all be conquered as idea. Only architecture of intellectual relevance, the Architektur der geistigen Beziehung, as Mies calls it, imparts to building that necessary independence which protects it against extrinsic claims and unilateral incursions, regardless whether these arise out of the objective technical conditions or from a subjective urge to expression. This concept of a self-reliant architecture arose out of the intellectual tradition founded in the 18th century in the architectural writings, for example, of Marc-Antoine Laugier. And I show you here this juxtaposition, Mies in front of the Farnsworth House under construction. There seems to be a reoccurrence of the Architectura pointing out to the laws of architecture. It looks like Mies has his right arm up to point to somewhere which we don't know. The writings of Logier and Carlo Lodioli, and stretched, by the way, of Gottfried Semper, Viollet-le-Duc, Julien Guadet, Auguste Choisy, Berlage into the 20th century. It is from this rationalistic point of view of a building art that is perceived and perceivable by reason, in which the necessary is reshaped by the idea, and in which truth and logic claim form-binding priority, that Mies's architecture argumented with its enlightened postulate of a world shaped by man himself. Mies's architecture must, I believe, viewed against this background. Thank you very much for your patience. If you want to ask me questions, please feel free to do so. But you can do it on Friday as well. Thank you very much. I like this. Killed by me. You don't have to worry about your... Yeah, as long as I read